Welcome back to Let Them Eat Bread, guys. Today we are making Joshua Weissman's sandwich loaf, okay, his regular supermarket loaf. He claims this is the easiest recipe ever. So I disagree, but we'll get to that a little later. Actually, because this recipe is so easy, I thought that it'd be fun if I did a little bit of a challenge for you guys. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do as much of this as possible without any tools at all. As few bowls, as few mixing devices as possible, okay? Yes, we are going to need sandwich tins. We are going to need bread tins for our final rise and our baking. However, except for that, our board, our whisk here, and our bench scraper, I'm going to try to use as few tools as possible, all right? So let's get started.
So I'm starting with 3 cups of flour just sitting out on my table here. Next up, we are going to reach for our water. We are pouring our water in here to get ready. Next, we're going to put in the milk. This is so that we have a nice good amount of liquid for our yeast. We're going to mix that up real quick. I've used warm water and warm milk. This is our yeast. We're putting in 1 packet or 2¼ teaspoons of active dry yeast. Next will be our sugar. It'll be 1 tablespoon of sugar. And we're just going to give those a quick stir and wait for 5 minutes till that is ready to go. In the meanwhile, we are going to put some salt, about 1 to 2 teaspoons. I'm using about a tablespoon, and we're just clumping that together and mixing that all together with my hands. And then we are reforming the bowl, the little well that we're going to need to pour our dry ingredients into. This is all while our yeast is getting ready. So be careful about how you shape your well. You want to make sure that it can handle all this liquid. And now in goes the yeast mixture. We're just pouring that all the way in. And then we are going to use 2 fingers to go into our mixture here and to stir around. Now I've sped up the camera footage here so you can just kind of see I'm using my bench scraper to take the outer flour, the outer wall of my flour well here, and just mix it in. And it'll slowly start to come together. So it just takes time. Don't worry about it. You will eventually get there. And eventually you'll be able to use your bench scraper or your other hand to just get the dough to kind of come together exactly how you need it to. It will require a thorough kneading. And I actually started with a little less than 3 cups of flour on my board to start with because I wanted to make sure I had a wetter dough as opposed to a drier dough. Once you're there, though, just add a little more flour if you need it, and you will be right, set, and ready to go. So we're just going to keep kneading this a little while longer, make sure it can pass the window pane test, which we are about to subject it to in just a moment here. I'm just getting all that last little bit of flour off my board and kneading a bit more just to make sure that is exactly where it needs to be. So now we are rolling it into a ball before we do our window pane test, and I'm just taking a little piece of dough using my thumb and finger to flatten it out all the way and stretch it out, and look at that. And it broke in the corner a little bit afterwards, but that's okay. So now we're going to combine our butter, 1 tablespoon, 2 tablespoons, and okay, Ben, get the plastic out. There you go. Good job, Ben. All right, 3rd tablespoon. We have 3 tablespoons total of butter, and we are just going to knead all this butter in by hand. This is what is called an enriched loaf because we are not just using water and flour and salt and yeast. So we're just getting the last of this butter in. It's going to be sticky, but don't worry about it. It will be great and delicious. So once again, putting this into ball form before we move on to our next step of rising.
All right, now we are going to cover up our bread now that it is fully, our dough now that it is fully ready. So I'm going to be just putting a sheet of plastic wrap over it and then putting a towel over it. Once you do that, you're going to want to set a timer for about an hour. I'm doing a board, so it's going to take a little longer for me. I'm going to set a timer for an hour, minute, and 15. If you have a cold room, feel free to do that as well. But we're just going to let this set on the board right here for about an hour and 15 hour, just until it doubles in bulk, all right? And we're going to go into our politics portion. We have so much to talk about this week, you don't even know. So I'm going to cover this up, then we will set our timers and make sure that we are ready to go. If you're sticking around for the politics, that's awesome. Let's cover our bread and I'll be right back. If you're not, I'll see you about an hour and 15 minutes for how to shape it and to properly shape it and to get it ready for cooking. All right, guys, I'll be right back. All right, we are back and we're about to go into our politics segment. Our bread is covered. You can't even see it because the towel is the same color all the way through. And our timer is set for about an hour and 15 minutes. So if you are sticking around for the politics, great. Let's dive into it. All right, let's get started. So the first story I want to talk about this week is the pandemic over? No, of course it's not. But I do want to report specifically on one story that I think is illustrative of why we shouldn't be letting our guard down. So, friend of yours and mine and friend of the show, Lauren Ashcraft, recently came down with COVID. She thinks the Delta variant, although she's not sure. And by the way, she's vaccinated and she didn't know how it was going to affect her partner, so she decided to stay in a COVID hotel. By the way, if you're in New York City specifically, I think it's all of New York State, but if you're in New York City specifically, call 311 if you have coronavirus and you need a place to quarantine. The city will provide you with a hotel for free. This is a great service. If you need to take advantage of it, please do. So, going back to Lauren's story. Now, she was feeling pretty sick when she got sick with coronavirus, but she isn't in really serious condition. And by the way, that's because she's vaccinated, right? This story is not like, oh, the vaccine doesn't work. The vaccine does work. And instead of stopping her from getting the disease, what it did is ensure that she was able to recover and she was able to not be super sick or end up in the hospital. So even though there are still breakthrough cases, and by the way, because Delta variant is so much more contagious than what would be called alpha variant or the original variant of coronavirus, it's still possible, and more of these breakthrough cases are likely. Okay, so just so you know. Also, where she got sick was she was at an event where she was one of very few people masked. Okay, so this, by the way, does not mean that masks don't work, but what it means is, like with vaccines, everyone has to participate so that we're all protected, right? Those people who can't wear a mask or those people who can't get vaccinated, right? We get vaccinated, we wear masks to protect them. So Lauren was wearing her mask. She was being responsible. She was doing all the things that she had to do, but she still got sick, which means that if you are wearing a mask and no one else is, you're actually still in danger. And that can be a scary thought, but it just means that you need to be stern with the people around you. If they're not going to wear a mask and they're indoors, you need to ask them to keep a social distance of 13 feet, okay? I'm about 6 feet and change tall. It's about 2 of me, all right? So you need to tell people to keep their distance if they're not going to mask, or just let them mask, right? And it's much less likely that you will get sick. Now, luckily, Lauren has recovered. She is back quarantining at home. Her partner is unaffected, which is great. But it's important that we get vaccinated. It's important that we get boosters if they're available to us. And it's important that we continue to mask in situations where we're not sure about whether other people are sick. And by the way, especially if you're indoors with other people and you don't know about them, their vaccination status and things like that, it's really important to keep masked. By the way, one other thing that's important to remember is that even if you have 2 shots, 3 shots of whatever vaccine, you can still give the virus to someone else, even if you don't get sick, right? So it's possible that you catch coronavirus in a sense, which is to say that you get the virus, but you don't feel any symptoms because the vaccine is essentially stopping you from feeling those symptoms, from getting sick, as it were, but you can still pass that pathogen on to other people who are not vaccinated. And remember, there are large portions of the population who cannot get vaccinated for whatever reason, right? They're immunocompromised, or the way the vaccine is created is not going to work well with their immune system, or what have you, right? There are real, legitimate medical reasons not to get vaccinated. Any other reason is not legitimate. Sorry, not sorry, okay? So I think it's really important that we use Lauren's story as an example as to how we have to maintain our diligence. So if you're inside with people you don't know their vaccine status, and you don't know whether they're sick, please mask up. And if you're not going to mask and they're not going to mask, keep at least 13 feet apart from you, okay? So I'm about 6 feet from the camera, right? From the camera in front of me. double that, right? So just get a sense, or however tall you are, you can figure out what 13 feet is. It's not hard, okay? If you're going to be with people who are masked, you should still try and keep 6 feet apart if you can. I get it. Sometimes we're just in spaces where that's not possible, but as much as you can, guys, this pandemic isn't over. We are still in a situation where other people can get sick, and we are still in a situation where the virus can continue to mutate because we don't have an equal distribution of vaccines throughout the world, right? And if we did, maybe we'd be in a better position to try and figure out, how to really combat this for real. But for example, China, who kept their cases really, really low for a long time with which what many people would call draconian measures, they have cases again, and even those ordinarily draconian measures just aren't working as well as they used to. So it's really important to remember that, like, there are actually things that you as an individual can do to help stop the spread, right? So stay home when you can. When you do have to leave, make sure that you're protected. We're coming up on the holiday season, right? And in the United States. By the way, happy Diwali to all our friends who celebrate. I hope you had a wonderful and bright festival of lights. But, there are holiday seasons going on throughout the world. The festive season, I believe it's in Nepal, or maybe it's Indonesia. I apologize for not remembering which of those two countries is entering a festive season right now. But wherever you are in the world, whatever your festivities involve, typically festivities involve the gathering of people, right? We celebrate together. It's a very human thing for us to do. It is how it is. So at this point, we should be thinking about ways that we can be safe. If you know in advance who you're going to be spending your holidays with, contact them, ask them what their vaccination status is, if they're comfortable telling you. If people are not going to get vaccinated, and sometimes you just won't convince people, or sometimes people can't be vaccinated, right? As I said, make sure that you are implementing some form of social distancing, that you make sure that there is no chance that individuals in your life get sick from having to be exposed to the virus from the holiday season, right? We all want to return to some semblance of normal, but we're not there yet. And by the way, it's very likely that we never get back to what normal used to be. Or if we do, there's always a fear, like with the common cold or the flu, that the disease is just endemic. And by the way, endemic just means that it's a disease that exists amongst the population and it flares up and doesn't flare up. But like the flu, right? So we get annual flu shots, sometimes more than one if there's a big deal. But coronavirus may be the same thing, right? So regardless of what holidays you're celebrating, regardless of who you are spending time with in these next couple of months, please make sure to keep yourself and your friends safe from anything you might be able to spread by wearing a mask and getting the vaccine if you haven't yet, if it's available to you, of course. And for everyone else, please encourage them to wear masks and to keep social distancing. We do, as individuals, have the power to help stop the spread of the pandemic. Please, I'm begging you, for Lauren's sake, for my sake, for the sake of all of your friends and family, please continue to be safe. We are not out of the woods just yet, and it's going to be hard. It's going to be another kind of problematic holiday season if people aren't being responsible. We don't want to see the kinds of numbers in January that we saw last January from the holiday season. As I said, I'm in America. We're moving towards Thanksgiving. For those who follow the Jewish calendar who are in the United States, Hanukkah is coming up right afterwards, about a week or so later. And then, 2 weeks after that is Christmas. There's just so many holidays occurring in this season. If you do gather with people, if you do spend time with people, please, for their sake and for yours, stay masked up if you can, get vaccinated, make sure that you know the vaccination and sick status of everyone you interact with, and just please be safe, guys. It can be really hard if you haven't gotten sick to feel like, that you're doing your part. And I know there's lots of people who are not doing their part and are loud and proud about it, but we have to stay vigilant. It doesn't matter your political affiliation. This is a disease. It doesn't give a shit if you're Republican or Democrat or left wing or right wing or independent. It doesn't matter, dude. No one cares. No, the virus doesn't care what your political affiliation is. If you don't take responsibility to stop spreading this virus, there's a chance you could catch it. And the longer we stay with this virus, the more chances it has to mutate into some terrible virus that is that can beat the vaccines. Now, we did just get great news out of the UK as far as the coronavirus is concerned, that there is a pill that they're looking at right now, which may be able to, I believe Merck makes it, that is able to treat coronavirus, and in that once you get it is actually a really good treatment for it. By the way, this is not to say you should not get vaccinated. You absolutely should. These pills should be a last resort. But if we can mass make these pills and we get them out to people, then even if you are vaccinated and you do get a breakthrough case, again, you can prevent it from being serious. The whole point of this whole exercise is to prevent death, is to prevent hospitalization, is to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves, our friends and family, and our extended friends and family, which I'll say is our the people who work in hospitals and medical centers who are dealing with coronavirus patients on a grandiose scale, literally on a scale that we can't imagine. So again, I know I'm kind of ranting at this point. Please get vaxxed, okay? Wear masks where you can, be safe, don't travel unless you have to. And as we come to the holiday season, be extra careful, guys. We're going to be encountering people, lots of people, some of which we just, even if you know someone's status, still be careful, all right? We can get through this together. You can save yourself and your family a lot of heartache by not killing off a friend or a family member or getting yourself killed. All right. So do the right thing, social distance, mask up, get vaxxed. Together we can help stop the spread. So please do that. I am begging you. So, as you may have heard, COP26, the climate conference taking place in Glasgow, is going on right now. But I'm here to give you some bad news about the conference. It failed. Okay. And your first reaction seeing this might be to be, hey, Ben, it's not over yet. How can you say it failed? Well, I'm going to give you some examples. Okay. So, this conference was essentially billed as humanity's last chance to really make a plan to keep us in the safe zone. And by the way, just a reminder, the safe zone is 1.5 degrees centigrade of global average temperature rise, okay? Now, there was also talk about 2 degrees centigrade that we could get to, but really the safe zone is 1.5, right? We are going to experience cataclysmic levels of climate change, and it's going to affect lots of people in very deleterious ways as we move forward, but after 1.5. So 1.5 is incredibly ambitious, but we have to get there in order to prevent some of the larger cataclysmic events from happening. Okay, 2 degrees, we're as a species is still safe, but we're gonna have it's going to be rough. Okay, I guess that's the best way to put it. So, and the scientists, the best estimates of the scientists are that we have about until 2030. Now, apparently, given recent reports, and including one that I talked about on the show a bunch of weeks ago, that estimate is actually very liberal in not in a political way, but just in the sense that we kind of giving us more credit than is due. 2030 may actually be too long of a timeline. Now, if you'll remember, originally we were talking about 2050, right? Like way back when we first started talking about climate change, just as a population in general, we were talking about 2050 as being a good goal. And now we've moved that up to 2030 because the climate is changing at a much faster rate now, right? We are emitting more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at an accelerated rate. And the climate is reacting to that in a way that is much more accelerated than scientists had originally anticipated. So whether you believe 2030 is the right number, or you're referring to the study that I covered weeks ago, which says, hey, we have about 2 years to get our shit together, doesn't really matter, right? This conference was more or less the last opportunity for humanity to get its shit together, to get a real plan together, to abandon fossil fuels, to abandon deforestation, to make real efforts to improve logistics, to minimize industries that produce greenhouse gases, and to to create a plan to transform a green economy, not just on their own, but also to create allowances for nations that have yet to develop yet, right? So just an aside real quick, there is this idea out in the world having to do with peak carbon emissions. So essentially, think about it this way. So as an economy develops, I'm making a graph now. So as economies develop, they produce more and more greenhouse gases, and at some point they peak, right? In theory, they peak, they get up to a certain level of greenhouse gases, and then they start to transition to a green economy. And the idea is once they peak, they start to come down, and over time will either get to near zero, net zero, or actual zero. Those words are things I discussed in a previous video, so please feel free to just pause this video, go check out on YouTube my near zero, net zero, and zero conversation about greenhouse gases. Okay, moving back along. So there is this idea that you have to create allowances for countries that are going to peak and then start to transition to green economies, because they actually can't get to a green economy until they move through kind of the coal phase, as it were, the greenhouse gas producing phase of their economic development. Now, this isn't necessarily true, but given the trajectory that many countries are on, this seems to be a reality, right? So I would argue that it's not required, but it does seem to be the direction that many countries are going, especially in the developing world. So because that is the case, the reality on the ground, which we cannot deny, as richer countries, as more developed countries, we have to create these allowances, right? Which means we need to do more work, because in theory, we've already peaked, right? We've already hit that area, and we should be starting to come down in a significant fashion. So, but we're not doing that, right? And to get to some of the examples that I wanted to give you as to how COP26 has failed, let's start with India, shall we? So Narendra Modi gave a speech, and he said that, so the speech was all good up until he started talking about India was going to decarbonize 50% of its economy by 2030. So I'm just going to pause right there. And by the way, this speech is everywhere. You can look it up. I'm not making this shit up. So Modi, I know you're not watching, but in case you are, remember how I said the 2030 was like the line? Like, we're fucked at that point? Like, that's the we're fucked point? Did you miss that part of the memo? Okay, so 50% of India's carbon emissions reduced by 2030. Already, by the way, that's terrible. First of all, I don't know how he's planning to do this, and this is especially curious given his next comment, okay? But starting with this comment, how are you going to decarbonize half of India's economy in 9 years? And by the way, we're at the end of 2021, so 8 years. You've got 8 years, you're going to reduce India's carbon emissions by half. Okay, that's a little sus. Second, so he continues his speech. And the next thing he says is, oh, we're going to be totally carbon neutral, right? That's net zero, neutral, net zero, okay? By 2070. Dude, it's too late, son. That's too late. 2070, the seas will be like 200 feet higher by then. Are you fucking kidding? 2070. Dude, there won't be an India by 2070, bro, okay? At that point, it will be, the sea levels will be so high that, yeah, sure, maybe it'll be net zero because all of India will be underwater. It can't produce carbon emissions at that point. Like, okay, I'm being a little facetious, but holy shit, man. 2070? No. This whole conference is a failure. India, by the way, is one of the largest developing economies in the world, okay? They produce tons and tons and tons of emissions, of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, not as much as China, not as much as the United States, okay, fair, whatever. but they're on the trajectory, right? They're still moving towards their peak. If we are agreeing on a world level, and it seems that we are, that this peak is a thing, you go up and then you come down. India's not even there yet, man. How are you going to do this? This plan. So first of all, let's just look at the math for a second. Excuse me. Let's look at the math for a second, because none of this adds up. So apparently, half of India's economy is going to be decarbonized in 8 fucking years, and then it's going to take 40 years to decarbonize the rest. Fuck out of here. Decarbonize half the economy in 8 years. India is the second most populous country on the face of planet Earth. 1 billion people. You're going to decarbonize 1 billion people halfway, so 500 million people, let's be generous, in 8 years. Fuck out of here. Fuck out of here. There's no way. It's just not going to happen. By the way, when people say this was the last conference where we could actually do something, they don't mean it because the world is ending next year. They mean it because if we don't really start changing our lives like today, or I guess by January, whatever, we're not going to be able to stop this. And you just get to a point where you get super doomer about this whole thing. The Indian economy is not going to decarbonize until 2070. Oh, for fuck's sake. Okay. Another example. Vladimir Putin, the head of state of the Russian Federation, didn't show up. He sent a video message. Dude, people are negotiating climate deals here. What are you doing? You're not going to show up. Why wouldn't you show up? First of all, Russia, in some ways, is partially a developing economy in some parts of it. They could be heading towards their peak, too. Isn't it important for Russia to be here? Yeah, it is. And by the way, Russia is experiencing climate change. Siberian forests that were frozen for hundreds of years are on fire. What the fuck? Why aren't you there? And then, third example, last example. Oh, well, maybe not last example. I might think of some other ones, but Bolsonaro from Brazil wasn't there either. Dude, the Amazons are called the fucking lungs of the earth. You're not at COP26? The fuck, why not? Because people don't like you because you're a fucking fascist and a moron? Oh my God. Literally, like, I cannot even begin to tell you how fucked we all are. All right? The two nations who are either actively experiencing climate change or gutting our chance at getting the climate at all the fuck fixed, just didn't show up. India is out here being like, don't worry, we got this shit by 2070. And then if you look at the more development nations, the United States, China, and the UK, yeah, you had some great speeches. Joe Biden fell asleep at the conference. I don't understand. Like, I don't know what we're going to do. I genuinely have no idea what we're going to do, because, like, talk is cheap, man. These leaders, they can say all the words they want to say, but at the end of the day, like, look, Joe Biden, Boris Johnson, they're going to be dead, man, before this really takes effect. I'm 28. This is my future. When I'm looking to buy a house, I have to think about how high above the ground it is. Right? Sea levels are going to rise. We have made no progress, none at all, in fighting this. And by the way, the only progress we made recently as a species in fighting climate change, just in general, is the coronavirus pandemic. Why? Because people had to stay at home. So it took a fucking disease for us to even get a little bit of reprieve from climate change. And by the way, we've reversed all of that. Gone, totally gone. And also, when there was a hole in the ozone, I believe it was above Australia, but don't quote me on that. When there was a hole in the ozone, the world came together and was like, oh shit, there's a hole in the ozone. We should fucking fix that. And they banned CFCs, fluorocarbons, something fluorocarbons. I can't think what the C is. Sorry, guys, but I'm just really upset, guys. I'm sorry. This is getting a little off the rails, but Final thought on this, and I promise I'll stop talking about it because I'm just getting so mad. I'm just getting so frustrated, guys, about all of this. Like, there have been 26 of these conferences. They've been talking about this shit since the 70s. Dude, Angela Merkel's been at most of them. We have not made any progress. None. And it looks like we're not going to be able to sue the people who have made this into a disaster. It looks like we're not going to be able to substantively force these polluting industries to stop doing what they're doing. I mean, genuinely speaking, look, if you're a young person and you've given up on this, you've given up on having a family, and you've given up on whatever else because of climate, dude, I don't blame you. Like, I just can't. I cannot blame you. Because you look at COP26, and by the way, there were protesters there. There are people, tying themselves to things, gluing themselves to things, trying super hard to just get people to care. And like, you have the biggest economies in the world who are just not doing anything at all for this. And actually, there's one. Oh, sorry, last thing. Okay, one of the island nations, I forget who it was. He said in his speech, the head of state of one of these island nations, and again, I apologize, forget who it is. I'm just so frustrated. I'm just not thinking straight right now. He said, "There is no dignity in a slow death. You might as well bomb our islands instead of leaving us to this slow death." Can you imagine? Can you imagine asking for rich nations to kill your entire population? Not literally, of course, because that would be a more painless death than dying from climate change. Dude, I'm on the verge of tears right now. Like, I cannot possibly imagine what it's like to be on Madagascar right now, or on these island nations where the water is rising. Dude, people are watching their whole everything just vanish. What are we doing? What in the actual fuck are we doing? And by the way, so I know I keep saying last thing, but if we don't move in the direction of eco-socialism, where, and what I mean by that is a truly democratic system, democratic all the way down to the means of production, which actively fixes the climate, we're going to end up in eco-fascism. Strong men and strong women and strong whatever are going to oppress people for the sake of the climate. Like, we're running out of options, guys. And if we don't move in a direction where we fundamentally change how we do literally everything, we are going to be negligent perpetuators of genocide on a scale that we have never seen on Earth. And if there are people who come after us, they will look back on us like the scum that we are. All of us, everyone in a rich country, leaders, people who work, no, people who are not advocating for this kind of stuff, who aren't talking about this stuff regularly. Dude, it's all of our faults, man. If we can't get our shit together and save our species and not commit this crazy ass genocide that we're moving towards, where people on island nations and people in the global south are eradicated by climate change. All right, I gotta end this segment. I can't do this anymore. All right, guys. This went on forever, but COP26 failed. I don't know what we're gonna do next. It's too much. It's just too much. Usually I have water for this. I'm just went with something a little more spicy because what I'm talking about is a little more spicy today. So in the United States, we had elections on Tuesday, November 3rd, 2nd, November 2nd. We had elections, and I don't want to talk about the results of the elections. You know, you can find those out on your own. You can cheer or be sad or whatever, it doesn't matter. But I wanted to talk about something kind of in that same vein, right? So I want to talk about electoralism. And by electoralism or electioneering or whatever you want to call it, I'm just talking about the practice of going out, garnering votes, getting people to vote for you, getting people to like you. Like, how do you do that, right? Like, electoralism, think about it as like the study of how you get elected. All right, it's not particularly complicated. Well, it seems complicated, but it's not. I guess that's the point I want to make. It's not complicated at all. So, at its base level, forget about systems, forget about, other things. Just for a moment, let's go down to a base level. What is the purpose of politics? Politics is about passing policy, right? The whole game of politics, getting elected, running for office, the whole shtick is for the sole purpose of saying, hey, I have these ideas about my insert jurisdiction type here. I want to implement them, and the people who are presently in power are not implementing them or not implementing them well. So I want to throw my hat in the ring and say, hey, clearly it's difficult for you guys to do this. So instead, I am going to try my hand at doing this. And I'm doing it because I believe in XYZ policy, right? The end goal of politics, regardless of what system you're under, is to enact policy or to stop policy from being enacted, right? So this is kind of the constant. So in electoral systems, where electoralism is the most important, I would argue, getting elected on promises is one thing. But once you're in power, you have two options. Three. One is to pass the policy that you desire into law. And, if you're in the majority, that's easy. Two, if you're not the majority or, there's resistance, to fight to convince people that these policies are appropriate policies for your jurisdiction, right? So even if you can't win on the policies, fight for them. Or you could just not do any of those things and just be in power for power's sake. But I wouldn't do that because in theory, then if you do that, on the other end of all of this, you face the voters, right? You come up for re-election every so often, as it is. And you need to explain to the voters of this jurisdiction, whatever it is, or district or electoral area or whatever you want to call it, that, hey, you should re-elect me, right? I didn't get my promises done, but I'll get them done next time. Or if you elect me and all my friends, then we will get our promises done. We promise to continue to fight for this, right? So if you haven't done anything in the time that you've been in office, then the people who sent you there on your promises are going to think, hey, he or she or they broke their promises. You said you were going to do something and then you didn't do anything. You didn't even fight for the thing that you said you were going to do. Therefore, I, as a voter, have concluded that you are not worth voting for, and I will vote for someone else, right? Makes sense. Very simple. Now, if you fight for something, you still might lose, right? Because they say, hey, well, you fought for it, but you didn't change enough hearts and minds. And I, the voter, think that someone else can change more hearts and minds than you can, or fight harder, or fight better, or whatever. So you still might lose, but at least then you go to the people and you say, hey, look, I tried. Look, I fought really hard. These are the things I did. These are the speeches I gave. I tried really hard to get you the things that I promised to do. But hey, I wasn't in the majority. Or I had to negotiate it out for this other good thing or whatever, right? I couldn't do my promises, but I did fight for them. I did try, and I have the potential, the capacity to get the things that I promised last time if you reelect me this time. Okay? Obvious, good thing, right? You can do. And then there is the doing the thing, right? So, hey, I promised you I was going to do this. You elected me to office, and I did it. And now I'm promising you that I'm going to either maintain the thing that I promised to do, if it's that kind of thing, or I have these new ideas about what can improve your lives, and I'm going to go and do them. I was so successful last time. You should reelect me so I can do those things again. And this is really what electoralism comes down to. It's not difficult. Now, sure, you throw systems on top of it, you throw other unfairnesses, gerrymandering, corporate money, first past the post system. There are lots of hurdles. It's true. I'm not discounting that at all. But at the very base of this conversation, you need to deliver something for the people, or they will not vote for you. Now, there are some exceptions to this rule, right? You can say, hey, true, I didn't deliver for you, but the other guy or gal or they is so bad that if you elect me, at least it won't be them. And if they get elected, they will enact policies that are bad, that you do not like. So I will at least stop them from doing that because I will be there instead of them. Fair point. Okay. But that's not a very convincing argument. Because you're not promising anything. Now, if you go in, and by the way, part of elections, there are people who are not partisans, who are not going to vote just based on a party line. They consider themselves independents, or they may subscribe to more than one party, or they may have very specific preferences, policy preferences, that they will just not show up to vote at all if those policy preferences are not addressed. And by the way, that is fair. Quick aside, if you're a politician, the voters cannot fail you. You can only fail them. If you don't get elected, it's because you suck. If you do get elected, it means you probably don't suck, or at least you suck slightly less than the other person. Okay? Again, not difficult. So, recap for all the politicians who are not watching this. If you don't get elected, the voters did not fail you. You failed them. Not difficult. Okay. Where was I? Yes. So, hello, voice crack. So, essentially, promising to stop someone else from doing something is an argument that you can win with. It's fair, okay? And especially if the other person is really, really bad, right? But that is not a workable electoral strategy. It is a much more workable electoral strategy to say, hey, people of this district or electoral area, not only am I going to stop such and such a person from doing their bad things, but I'm also going to do these things for you. Typically, by the way, the reason that other person proposes very bad thing is because either the system is not working for them and they propose something that they think is extreme enough to work, or there's just a large divide in the country or jurisdiction or what have you, and that particular issue is not popular for you, but it is popular for them. There's plenty of issues like this, right? But let me give you an example of kind of what I'm talking about. If the other candidate says, hey, I am going to murder all refugees who come to this country before they get here because we need to make sure that only people who are here can get the benefits of being here. Okay, that sounds like a pretty extreme policy. And it is, obviously. Okay. Don't do this, by the way. So your immediate reaction as a politician might be, hey, we're not going to murder refugees when they come here. Or if you elect me, refugees will not get murdered when they come here. Okay, so stop here. Essentially, what's happened now is that the politician that I am representing is saying, I am just not going to do what they say that they are going to do. I have not promised anything. However, if I say instead, not only will voting for me lead to refugees not being murdered, but also we're going to send more bureaucrats to our border to process refugees to make sure that if refugees do come here, they go through all the processes and they're double checked and verified, and they have the capacity and wherewithal and means to become citizens of this jurisdiction. Okay. Now, personally, I don't agree with that particular opinion. I would rather just everyone be let in, but that is a promise, right? This thing is bad. It's not, if you elect me, it won't happen. And I'm also going to do this to make the thing better. Do you see the difference? Okay. So as we move through elections, and especially in the United States, as we preview elections, these sets of elections here are going to essentially be previews of what are called the midterms, the biennial? Yes, the biennial elections, which occur between the election of the chief executive, the president. Typically what happens, for those of you who do not know, is the party who has the presidency typically loses one or two bodies of the legislature. In the US, it's just typically the way it works, unless, they do something really good. And, sometimes it does. But the point of this segment, really, is to remind you all out there that it is not difficult for the party who has just lost lots of seats or may potentially lose lots of seats to retain them. You simply have to do something for the people who voted you in. Because if you don't, they either are going to vote the other way, or, which is much more likely in as divided a country as we have here in the United States, they just won't show up. And where in a country where elections are typically close, in a lot of places, some small group of people not showing up is actually a pretty significant change. So we need to, and by the way, this is, just true general of socialists. We need to be continuing to promise things and to fight for things really hard. Look, especially in the United States, it is very rare or impossible that socialists like myself will ever have the majority in legislative bodies around the country, whether it's the national level or local level. Okay, we get it. But in order for us to continue to get elected, to increase the chances that we get a majority, not only do we have to promise to do good things, which we should continue to do, but we also have to make sure that no matter what we promise, we don't allow that thing to be destroyed. Or if we do, it's involuntary and we fight like hell. Because if you don't fight, and, the opposite of what you want gets passed, then it's not really worth having you there. Being a socialist, ascribing to a particular ideology is not reason enough for you to retain a seat in a legislature or any office for that matter. It's about what you do. Labels are all nice and all, and I use them, and most of us use them, especially on the left. We like to out-label each other. It's just a thing that we do. But that label is bupkis if it's not backed by anything. So electoralism, this practice that I'm talking about, it's not difficult. do right by the people, and they'll do right by you. It's not hard. Okay? If you're a politician and you're listening to this, which you're probably not, just do things people want. Read a fucking poll. It's not hard. People poll the American people all the time. Oh, wait, not just America, of course, but like, if you're a politician and you want to know how to get reelected, read a poll. It's not hard. You'll figure it out. I believe in you. I mean, I don't, but you got this. You'll be fine. So, in light of the impending civil war in Ethiopia, so just a bit of context real quick. There's a region of Ethiopia called Tigray. There is a militarized force there called the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF. And essentially, they are unhappy with the central government of Ethiopia, and they have decided to take that dissatisfaction to arms and are moving through the country, conquering towns, displacing the Ethiopian military, and as of recently, they've aligned themselves with another armed anti-government group, and they are going to push towards the capital. Okay. So in light of all that, I wanted to talk a little bit about countries with artificial boundaries and sectarian violence. And in this segment, by using the word sectarian, I don't mean like religious or anything specific. I just mean like some sector of the population being antagonistic to another sector of the population, or multiple sectors of the population being antagonistic to multiple sectors of the population. Doesn't really matter, right? Sectarianism is just more or less one group or multiple groups being opposed to one group or multiple groups in a population, okay? And then that coming to fighting, whether it's with arms or not, okay? Or just political disagreements, right? It's entirely possible that this is the way. So, Ethiopia is in Africa, lots of countries in Africa, and after the 1880s, commonly known as the Scramble for Africa, after I think a conference in Brussels, I'm forgetting the name of it exactly, or Berlin, I can't think of this. Oh, it's a shame that I can't remember this. Doesn't matter. So, all of the nations in Africa, almost all of them, pretty much all of them, have what I will call forced borders, which is to say that the present land borders of almost all of these countries were established by outsiders. In Africa, it's primarily Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and Portugal, the primary creators of these land borders. And oftentimes, these borders were drawn without any respect to who lived there. It was about what you could claim quickly, as in who could send explorers where, and what natural resources were held, and also what natural avenues there were from the internal portions of the country to the sea, because these countries were set up for colonial purposes for the most part, which is to say that resources were raw resources were extracted from the colony and sent out towards the mother country, who then manufactured finished goods and then sent them back and sold them for profit. Okay, it's more or less how colonialism works. So, when you have a country with borders like this, and by the way, the Middle East is like this a lot as well, you are going to have sectarian violence. Always. Because if you think about it, in a nation where people did not get to choose with whom they live from a fundamental sectarian manner, then there will always be one of two things occurring. So one of three things occurring. One, there will be hostile symbiosis, which I'm defining as you live in a country with your group, and you're antagonistic to the other groups in the country, but you remain in the country because there's benefits to it. You live in harmony with the other groups, and this is just kind of regular symbiosis or peaceful symbiosis, I guess you'd call it. Is there are other groups there, but you've figured out your differences with them, and maybe it's political, but there's no issue there. Or you just live in constant hostility, which is to say that you are hostile to the other groups in the country, and you are actively in the process of trying to remove yourself or themselves from the country for that reason. Okay. And in Europe, where many of the national boundaries were formed by the long, painstaking process of nation-state building, oftentimes this was done in a co-cultural way or co-religious way. A great example of this is the way that Germany, modern-day Germany, was created, which essentially was that Prussia, which was the largest of the what we would now call German principalities, essentially decided one day that it was going to conquer everybody else and create Germany. Bismarck, by the way, Otto von Bismarck was the chief architect of this, as well as his patron, Emperor Wilhelm. And they just went through and military conquered all these people. But all these folks spoke the same language. They had cultural things in common. And although Germany was essentially assembled by conquest and deal-making, the people who were brought into this new German country, it was Prussia at the time, or Bavaria, it was Prussia, sorry, at the time, the large nation that became Germany. They all had enough in common that the being brought together was not actually an issue. And you see this in the formation of lots of European states, where people are allowed to form large nation states by their co-culturalism. And you see this in the Far East as well. Essentially, any area that wasn't colonized, you kind of see this natural evolution of nation state building, which is co-cultural groups create, make deals with each other to create nation states, and those typically perpetuate to the modern day. Okay, and by the way, an example of a nation state that does not have a co-cultural background is Belgium. Belgium is a tripartite nation. They have the Flemish, the French, and the Germans, three groups who make up the Belgian population and government, right? Their reserve seats. There are ways to keep sectarian violence at bay. So it's not to say that it can't be done, but those groups actually have the opportunity to come together and be a nation, right? They formed that more or less on their own. It was not superimposed on them, or if it was so long ago that at this point it no longer matters, right? But if you look at Africa and the Middle East, and especially places like Ethiopia or Sudan, or Mauritania and Western Sahara, and a whole bunch of places where you can see this sectarian, and even Nigeria, by the way, where you can see the sectarianism, these borders were forced on these people without any sense of who they were and whether they played nice with the rest of the people in the playground, right? So let's take Nigeria, for example. So Nigeria has three major ethnic groups. They have the Hausa Fulani, they have the Igbo, and they have the Yoruba, the three major ethnic groups there. Now, Nigeria was cut up without the consent of any of those three people. And by the way, the Yoruba are not just confined to Nigeria. They also exist in Benin and Togo, nations to Nigeria's west. The Igbo don't just exist in Nigeria. They also have roots in nations to the east of Nigeria, including Cameroon. And the Hausa Fulani have a significant presence in Niger and other surrounding nations, including Cameroon, right? So if Africa had had the opportunity to kind of grow up on its own, we might have a Hausa Fulani land, a Yoruba land, and an Igbo land, and you might have had different groups of people in different countries create their own nation states based on their co-culturalism and background. But that was not the case. So these groups compete against each other for resources and for political power. And in doing so, they may come to violence because they've been pitted against each other for colonial purposes while this whole colonial project has gone forward, right? Remember, it's easier for a colonizer to create a situation where they're not the bad guy, but the other ethnic group is the bad guy. So you have these artificial borders that are created. And on top of that, you have the colonial power, who is essentially the root of all evil in most of these quote unquote countries, essentially saying that, hey, don't look up, look next to you, right? So you create the situation where no matter what happens, you are pushing the situation to the point of dangerous violence because these groups were not really ever meant to be friends, right? Now, mind you, it may have come about that they all formed their own nation states and then became friends later, but you have to let them do that on their own. When you create a situation where these distinct groups are competing for resources, and by the way, because of the mass extraction that colonial powers did to colonized powers, oftentimes these resources in the modern era are greatly reduced from the what they would have been if these nations had grown up on their own. You increase competition because there is actual scarcity in some of these places. So, as opposed to manufactured scarcity, which is what we see in rich nations. So, essentially, at the end of all this, you get to the situation where it's very dangerous for smaller groups to compete. And the more that these individual ethnic groups feel that they are being outcompeted or that they're not being treated fairly, they're going to want to break away. And by the way, it is very rare that the segregation of a country is done peacefully. Nigeria, again, serves as a great example here. There was a civil war because the Igbo wanted to leave. They said, hey, this situation ain't working for us. We're going to leave. And the Nigerian nation declared war on them and fought to get them back and eventually won. The Igbo are back in Nigeria. But essentially, and by the way, we're seeing this now in Tigray, right, in Ethiopia, because these nations were not built properly. So because of the way that these nations were established, you are never going to be in a situation where there is likely to be kind of a harmonious coexistence between the ethnic groups, because each of them see each other as enemies in many cases, but also as in the case of resources in many of these countries, it's a zero-sum game, right? You get the resources, so you don't get the resources. It's not like in rich countries where there are lots and lots of resources. Where do you think we got those resources from? We stole them from poor countries, from developing countries, from colonized countries. So we've essentially created a perfect storm where no matter where you have forced borders, whether it's Africa or the Middle East or what have you, where other nations have drawn borders and drawn artificial delineations between distinct cultural groups who have antagonistic goals, which is to provide themselves with resources and not necessarily anybody else with resources, you create sectarianism. And if that particular struggle becomes acute enough, you create sectarian violence. And so what we're seeing now in Tigray, and what we saw with Darfur in Sudan and South Sudan and Sudan, and what we see, what we see with the PKK in Turkey, coming from northern Syria, all these places where there are kind of cultural revolutionaries and cultural rebellions. What we see is that in situations where borders are forced, there is always sectarian violence, or there's always sectarianism in some way, shape, or form. So what's the solution, right? We can't go back in time and change it. Colonialism happened. All this stuff happened. We can't change it. We can't change the past to have it change now. But what we can do is we can say that, hey, if you want to break away from this particular nation, that's fine, but it needs to be done in a way that is peaceful. It needs to be done in a way that ensures that people who want to leave are able to leave. And it has to be done in a way where resources are not intentionally deprived from other groups, because then it doesn't become sectarian violence. It just becomes regular old war. And, you essentially have the same problem, just it looks a little different, right? So, and by the way, the obligation to do all of this is on rich countries, right? We, and I do include myself in this, right? As people who live in rich countries are benefiting from the pilfering of the resource supplies of poorer countries, of colonized countries. We bear the blame for the reason, for the overall reason that much of this is occurring in the first place. So if we are going to benefit from all of this shenanigans, all these shenanigans, we then need to put our cards on the table and be honest with the people that we have, for whom we've created this problem. And we have to do the hard work of allowing groups of people who want to be independent, but also to allow for the joint survivability of both of these nations. Because it's no good to just say, oh, you can go on your own. It's fine. Hey, country who's afraid of losing this group, don't be afraid of that. Don't react angrily to them. Just let them go. Because oftentimes, and sometimes the specific reason for the sectarianism is because one group may sit on some resources that the other group wants, right? So, and they may use the power of national unity as a sinister ploy to extract the resources from a particular group who wants to maintain ownership of that resource. So again, that's fair, but there's an obligation there to ensure that individual groups who want to become independent are allowed to do so, but also there needs to be work done to maintain the peace, right? Because if they have a specific resource, or if they're moving for resource purposes, they want to declare independence for resource purposes, you get to a situation where it becomes untenable to just tell them that leaving is okay, right? Because you're just going to have that same violence. It's just going to look different. So I guess the closing thought of this segment is that while we can't go back and change the colonial past to allow nations, to allow cultural groups, co-cultural groups to grow up into nation states on their own, what we can do as rich nations is to facilitate and broker agreements between aggrieved parties and to allow for as many independent ethnic groups to gain national status as desire to do so. But to make sure that effort to create, that effort to perpetuate self-determinism, which is just a fancy way of saying to allow people to do what they want, in order to perpetuate self-determinism, we also need to make sure that that in allowing that to perpetuate, we don't create more sectarianism, more violence, more war, and more death, right? The whole purpose of this exercise would be to create more peace. So if we allow for independent groups to become independent and don't mitigate the reasons for their independence and the reason that another group might want them back, we have not helped the process of peace. We have facilitated self-determinism at the expense of lasting peace, and we cannot do that. That is not a sustainable way of doing this. So if we are going to do the work, the real work of allowing for individual nation states to develop based on co-culturalism and anti-sectarianism, we need to also perpetuate the means that would allow for peace to be maintained between the departing group and the remaining group or groups. We're on the clock here. So there's one last little thing I want to talk about. It's been sitting on the whiteboard for a while. You've probably noticed. So FemBoss-ism isn't the goal. So what does this even mean? This just sounds like a bunch of gobbledygook nonsense. So FemBoss-ism is essentially the whitewashing or pinkwashing, I guess, of capitalism's badness, exploitative nature, by the placing of previously marginalized individuals in roles where they can be the oppressor instead. So it doesn't have to just be women, right? It can be people of color or other previously oppressed individuals. It could be whomever, right? Essentially, the point that socialists have about capitalism is not that capitalism is exploitative because certain individuals, by their inherentness, are more exploitative than others, or capitalism is exploitative because certain people run it, as in people who look a certain way run it. The message of socialism is that capitalism is exploitative because the system of capitalism is exploitative. It's systemic. So the solution to, hey, a bunch of old white males run almost all of the economy is not, hey, we should put some women and black people in charge of the economy, because they will just become the oppressors, the exploitators themselves. Putting them in a position of power and privilege in a capitalist society doesn't make the system less exploitative. It just changes the appearance of the person who is doing the exploiting. The incentives to be exploitative do not actually change because the color or face or hair length or piercing number or whatever, or biological sex or gender of the individual at the top changes. It just doesn't do that. Capitalism is exploitative because it extracts resources from those who work and it gives it to those who own. And if you give ownership to people who previously did not own things, sorry, persons who previously did not own things, and by that I mean marginalized persons as opposed to the working class, you still have bosses. The point is not to change what the boss looks like. The point is to not have a boss. And quick aside here, because this is an important thing that I've had conversations about before, and I think it's important to say. Not having a boss doesn't mean that you do your work unsupervised and that you don't work. It means work probably becomes more voluntary. It also means that where there is work being done, it can be supervised, but the supervisor and the laborer, I'll just give that example for now, have the same rights in determining how the business is run, right? It's both of them own the business the same amount. It does not fundamentally, the foreman or the supervisor doesn't have more power in the business in determining how the business runs than you, the laborer, do, right? That's what we mean by giving ownership to the workers, all of them, right? It doesn't have to do with, it has to do with who as a group is in charge, not necessarily that, hey, there are no bosses of any kind. There's no boss, which is to say there's no individual that labor value is extracted from workers and given to, right? There's not singular or a small group of individuals at the top who gain all the productive value of all labor in the system, right? That's what we mean by no bosses. We don't mean that there's no one who supervises your work and it's all total chaos. So now returning to the conversation about FemBoss-ism, is that the idea of a boss in socialist terms, right, is just say that someone who sits at the top and benefits from all the labor that's being produced is the problem with capitalism, right? Whether it's the owner or it's a group of owners or it's just a boss who works for someone else, right? The value of labor is being slowly extracted from the people who do most of the actual work and given to the top of the pyramid. It is literally a pyramid scheme, which is to say that those at the bottom essentially pay up to the top, and sure, they receive something in return, but they're ultimately losing value because of the way the system is set up. So essentially, the point of this segment, just before the timer goes off, is to say that where there is real equality, where there is real equity, it's not because we put a different face on the boss. It's that we took the boss out of the equation as a concept, and instead we gave the power, the decision-making, the profits, everything, not to an individual, but to all the workers who labor underneath a system. And that is what socialism is in a nutshell. FemBoss-ism is not the goal. Socialism, true democracy in the workplace, is the goal.
All right, guys, that timer means we are done, and here is our loaf doubled in size. Looks wonderful. Let's just take that plastic off real fast. Next thing we have to do is shape it. So punch it down, and then we are going to form this into a rectangular shape. So you can use a rolling pin or a wine bottle if you want to. I'm just using my hands to shape it out. And once we do, I'm taking my bench scraper to slowly and very, very carefully roll it up into a log. Okay, you want to be very careful with this process and take as much time as you need. You can even see that I'm re-rolling a little bit to get a nice shape as we go through this right before we plop it into our loaf pan. So first we have to butter the loaf pan. So take your now softened butter and just go right around and lubricate every nook and cranny of that loaf tin before you put your bread in it. Remember, put the bread in seam side down if you have a seam. Now look, we're perfectly buttered, and we are going to place our bread into the loaf tin. Come on, Ben, just put it in there. And come on, you can do it, and boop. Perfect. All right, we're putting a second lid on top of that one. We're going to allow this to rise for 1 hour until doubled in bulk, and then we're going to cook at 350 degrees for 35 to 40 minutes till registers 205. All right, guys, that's it for this week. There's no episode next week. I will see you in 2 weeks. Bye! Thanks for watching this video, guys. If you liked it, throw a like on it, share with your friends, and subscribe for more of our content. You can also find all of our videos and clips on youtube.com. Just search Let Them Eat Bread and you'll find all of our content. Alright guys, see you next time. Bye for now.